I never imagined that a small patch of land could cause so much trouble. But that's exactly what happened when I moved to Sycamore Ridge Estates in Scottsdale, Arizona. The vacant lot next to my new house seemed like an afterthought when I purchased my property 5 years ago, just a quarter-acre of desert scrub that I planned to eventually landscape. Little did I know it would become the centerpiece of a bizarre legal battle that would upend my life and send shockwaves through our entire community. My name is Zachary Ortiz, and this is the story of how my HOA president sold my land right out from under me, and how justice finally caught up with her. I moved to Sycamore Ridge after accepting a position at a software development company in Phoenix. The neighborhood appealed to me immediately: modern homes with desert landscaping, mountain views, and that perfect balance of privacy and community. The HOA fees seemed reasonable for the amenities: a community pool, tennis courts, and well-maintained common areas. During my first month, I received the standard welcome package from the Sycamore Ridge Homeowners Association, along with an invitation to the monthly meeting. The letter was signed by Margaret Wilson, HOA president. It emphasized the importance of community standards and included a thick handbook of rules and regulations. Just what I need, I muttered to myself as I flipped through pages of restrictions on everything from garbage can placement to approved exterior paint colors. But I'd heard horror stories about HOAs from friends, so I figured I'd better attend the meeting and get a feel for how things operated here. The meeting was held in the community center, a Spanish-style building with terracotta tiles and a fountain in the courtyard. About 30 homeowners sat in metal folding chairs as Margaret Wilson called the meeting to order. She was in her mid-50s with platinum blonde hair cut into a sharp bob, wearing a pink cardigan despite the Arizona heat. Her voice had that particular tone that suggested she was used to getting her way. "As you all know," she began, scanning the room with narrow eyes, "our property values depend on strict adherence to our community standards. Last month alone, we issued 17 violation notices." She said this with unmistakable pride, as though issuing citations was an achievement rather than a necessary evil. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, already wondering if I'd made a mistake buying in an HOA community. After the meeting, Margaret approached me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Ortiz, welcome to Sycamore Ridge. I noticed you've purchased the Sanchez property, including the adjacent vacant lot." "That's right," I replied, shaking her outstretched hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "Wonderful. Just remember that even undeveloped lots must be maintained according to Section 17 of our bylaws. No weeds taller than 6 inches, regular dust control measures, that sort of thing." "Of course," I said. "I'm still getting settled in the house, but I'll make sure the lot is taken care of." "See that you do," she responded, her smile tightening. "We don't tolerate neglect in Sycamore Ridge." Looking back, I should have recognized that interaction for what it was: a warning shot. Instead, I chalked it up to typical HOA zealotry and went about settling into my new home. For the first year, things were relatively peaceful. I kept the vacant lot clean, hiring a landscape service to control weeds and maintain the minimal vegetation. I attended HOA meetings when I could, though I soon noticed that Margaret ran them like a benevolent dictator, cutting off discussion that didn't align with her vision for the community. It was during my second year that I started hearing rumors about Margaret's husband, Larry Wilson. Apparently, he owned a real estate development company that had fallen on hard times after the housing market downturn. My neighbor, Tom Reeves, mentioned it while we were both washing our cars one Saturday morning. "Wilson Properties used to be a big deal around here," Tom explained, wiping suds from his SUV. "They developed several communities in North Scottsdale, but Larry made some bad investments right before the crash, and they've been struggling ever since." "That explains why Margaret is so obsessed with property values," I said. Tom nodded. She's been on the HOA board for 8 years and president for 5. Nothing happens in this neighborhood without Margaret's approval. I didn't think much about this conversation until 3 months later when I received a notice about my vacant lot. According to the letter, signed by Margaret herself, my property was in violation of Section 17.3 Inadequate Dust Control. The fine was $250, with an additional $50 accruing each day until the violation was resolved. I was furious. I'd been paying a service to maintain the lot, and I drove past it every day. There was nothing wrong with it. I called the number listed on the notice and got Margaret's personal cell phone. "This is ridiculous," I told her after she answered. "That lot is well maintained. I want to appeal this fine." "Mr. Ortiz," she replied coolly, "the inspection was conducted last Tuesday. There was visible dust blowing across the property. If you wish to appeal, you'll need to submit a formal request to the board and wait for the next meeting, which is in 3 weeks. In the meantime, the fine continues to accrue." "That's not fair and you know it," I said, trying to keep my temper in check. "The rules apply to everyone, Mr. Ortiz, even you." After hanging up, I immediately drove to check the lot. It looked exactly as it always had: neatly cleared desert landscape with some native plants. I took photos as evidence and then submitted my appeal. 3 weeks and $1,050 in accumulated fines later, the board voted to uphold the original violation. Margaret didn't even recuse herself from the vote. This pattern continued for the next 6 months. Every time I resolved one violation, another would appear. Improper weed control, unauthorized vegetation, excessive ground debris. Each time I would appeal, and each time the board would side with Margaret. I started attending every HOA meeting, bringing documentation to dispute the violations. I wasn't the only one having issues with Margaret's management, but I seemed to be getting the worst of it. Other homeowners would look at me sympathetically, but were reluctant to speak up. After accumulating nearly $5,000 in fines, I consulted an attorney, Deanna Jenkins, who specialized in HOA disputes. She reviewed my documentation and frowned. "They're targeting you, Mr. Ortiz," she said. "It's a pattern of harassment, and unfortunately, it's not uncommon. HOAs have tremendous power, and some boards abuse it." "What can we do?" I asked. "We can file a complaint with the state real estate department and potentially sue the HOA for selective enforcement, but these cases are difficult to win and expensive to litigate." I was weighing my options when Margaret dropped her bombshell at the next HOA meeting. "The board has voted to place a lien on Lot 143 for unpaid fines and begin foreclosure proceedings," she announced casually, not looking in my direction. Lot 143 was my vacant lot. The room fell silent as every head turned toward me. I stood up, hands shaking with anger. "You can't do that," I said. "Those fines are being disputed. I've documented every false violation." Margaret's smile was cold. "The board has made its decision, Mr. Ortiz. If you wish to prevent foreclosure, you'll need to pay the outstanding balance, which now totals $7,250 including administrative fees." I left the meeting in a daze and called Deanna immediately. She advised me to pay the fines under protest to prevent losing the property while we fought the case. I reluctantly wrote the check, draining a significant portion of my savings. What I didn't know was that Margaret had already set her plan in motion. 2 months later, I received a call from Tom while I was at work. "Zach, there's someone building on your empty lot," he said. "They've got a construction crew out there right now, breaking ground." I left work immediately and sped home to find a bulldozer and 3 workers clearing my land. A sign had been posted, "Future Home of Wilson Custom Properties." I approached the foreman, who was checking something on a tablet. "Excuse me, what's going on here? This is my property." The man looked confused. "Not according to our paperwork. This lot was purchased by Wilson Custom Properties last month. We have all the permits." My heart pounding, I called Deanna again. She told me to document everything and call the police to report trespassing. When the officers arrived, they reviewed the workers' permits, which appeared legitimate. They advised me that this was a civil matter that would have to be resolved in court. Back at home, I dove into researching what could have happened. It took hours of searching county records online, but what I found made my blood run cold. There was indeed a deed transfer for my vacant lot, dated 1 month earlier. Somehow, my property had been sold to Wilson Custom Properties, Larry Wilson's company, without my knowledge or consent. The next morning, I was at Deanna's office as soon as they opened. "This is fraud," she said, after reviewing the documents I'd printed. "Someone forged your signature on the deed transfer. We need to file an emergency injunction to stop construction and report this to the authorities immediately." We spent the next week in a flurry of legal activity. Deanna filed for an emergency hearing while I reported the fraud to the Scottsdale Police Department and the FBI's Real Estate Fraud Division. The construction temporarily halted due to the court order, but Margaret appeared unfazed when I confronted her at the next HOA meeting. "These are serious accusations, Mr. Ortiz," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Wilson Properties purchased that lot in a legitimate transaction. If there's been some misunderstanding, I'm sure the courts will sort it out." The investigation gained momentum when Detective Carlos Rodriguez from the Scottsdale PD's white-collar crime unit took an interest in the case. He interviewed me at length about my history with Margaret and the HOA. "We've had other complaints about Sycamore Ridge HOA," he admitted. "Nothing this serious, but enough to establish a pattern of behavior. Through Detective Rodriguez's investigation, we discovered that Margaret had used her position as HOA president to access my personal information, including copies of my signature from HOA documents. She had created a fraudulent power of attorney and used it to sell my vacant lot to her husband's company for a fraction of its market value, just $45,000 for land worth over $200,000. The fraud extended further than just my property. Detective Rodriguez uncovered evidence that Margaret had been running this scheme for years, targeting properties where owners had accumulated HOA fines or lived out of state. In total, she had fraudulently transferred 7 properties within Sycamore Ridge, all to either her husband's company or to shell companies they controlled. As the investigation expanded, other homeowners came forward with their own stories of intimidation and selective enforcement. Margaret had created a climate of fear within the community, using her position to enrich her family at the expense of her neighbors. 6 months after the bulldozer first broke ground on my property, Margaret and Larry Wilson were arrested at their home in Sycamore Ridge. The charges were extensive: real estate fraud, forgery, identity theft, mail fraud, and racketeering. Because they had used the U.S. Postal Service to send fraudulent documents, federal charges were also brought against them. The case attracted significant media attention. Local news vans parked outside the community gates, and reporters called me daily for comments. I declined most interviews, focusing instead on reclaiming my property and helping the prosecution build their case. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in downtown Phoenix. I sat in the courtroom, watching as Margaret was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, a far cry from her usual carefully coordinated outfits. She didn't look in my direction, keeping her eyes fixed straight ahead. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Vanessa Chen, laid out the state's case methodically. The evidence was damning: forged signatures, fraudulent notary stamps, bank records showing the transfer of funds, and Margaret's own emails discussing how to target certain properties. "Your Honor," Ada Chen concluded, "this was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a calculated, years-long scheme to defraud homeowners through abuse of power. The state requests that bail be denied as the defendants present both a flight risk and a continued danger to the community." The judge agreed, and Margaret and Larry were held without bail pending trial. In the months that followed, my life slowly began to return to normal. The court issued an order voiding the fraudulent sale of my lot, returning ownership to me. Construction damage was assessed, and Wilson Properties' assets were frozen to ensure restitution would be available to all victims. The Sycamore Ridge HOA underwent a complete restructuring. An emergency election was held, and a new board was formed, with strict oversight from the state real estate department. Many of Margaret's punitive policies were reversed, and a more collaborative approach to community governance was adopted. 1 year after the construction crew first appeared on my lot, I stood watching as they returned, this time hired by me to begin work on a desert garden I had designed. It would feature native plants, a small seating area, and a memorial plaque dedicated to homeowners standing up against corruption. The trial began in the fall, with both Margaret and Larry facing multiple felony counts. I was called as a witness, recounting my experiences with the HOA and the discovery of the fraudulent sale. Deanna sat with me in the courtroom for moral support as I testified. Margaret's defense attorney tried to paint her as a dedicated community servant who had merely made administrative errors. "Mr. Ortiz," he asked during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you repeatedly violated HOA regulations regarding your vacant lot?" "No," I replied firmly. Every citation I received was fabricated or exaggerated. The property was always maintained according to HOA standards. And yet the board consistently voted to uphold these violations. "Are you suggesting the entire board was corrupt?" Deanna had prepared me for this line of questioning. The board voted the way Margaret told them to vote. Several former board members have already testified to that effect. The defense attorney's strategy backfired as more homeowners testified about similar experiences. The prosecution also presented evidence from Margaret's computer, showing how she had targeted specific properties and homeowners who had crossed her. The most damning testimony came from Margaret's former assistant, Brenda Taylor, who had worked for the HOA for 3 years. Brenda testified that Margaret had instructed her to create false violation reports for certain properties, and had even bragged about how she was helping her husband's business by acquiring cheap land. She said the homeowners were too stupid to fight back, Brenda testified, her voice shaking. She said that by the time anyone figured it out, they'd have built and sold the homes for a huge profit. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for just 6 hours before returning with a verdict, guilty on all counts for both Margaret and Larry Wilson. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 1 month later. I attended with Deanna and several other Sycamore Ridge residents who had been victimized by the Wilsons' scheme. The courtroom was packed, with reporters filling the back rows. Judge Alina Barnes, a no-nonsense veteran of the bench, addressed the court before announcing her decision. "The court has reviewed the pre-sentencing report, the victim impact statements, and the recommendations from both the prosecution and defense," she began. What occurred in Sycamore Ridge Estates was not merely a violation of law, but a profound breach of community trust. She turned her gaze directly to Margaret, who still maintained the same rigid posture she'd displayed throughout the trial. "Mrs. Wilson, you used your position of authority to systematically target and defraud your neighbors. You weaponized an organization meant to protect community interests and instead used it for personal enrichment. This court cannot overlook the premeditation and persistence of your actions." Judge Barnes then announced her decision. Margaret Wilson was sentenced to 10 years in state prison for real estate fraud, with additional concurrent sentences for the other charges. Larry received 8 years for his role in the scheme. Both were ordered to pay restitution to all affected homeowners, totaling over $1.2 million. As the bailiff led Margaret away, she finally looked in my direction. There was no remorse in her expression, only cold anger. I realized then that she still didn't see what she had done as wrong in her mind. She was entitled to take what she wanted from those she considered beneath her. After the sentencing, I stood on the courthouse steps with Diana as reporters shouted questions. I decided to make a brief statement. Today, justice was served not just for me, but for every homeowner who has felt powerless against abusive HOA practices. What happened in Sycamore Ridge could happen anywhere if we don't remain vigilant. Homeowners associations serve an important purpose, but they must be transparent, fair, and accountable to the community they serve. In the aftermath of the trial, our community began the long process of healing. The new HOA board, led by Tom Reeves, implemented reforms to prevent similar abuses of power. All financial decisions now required multiple approvals, and violations had to be documented with photos and reviewed by a committee rather than a single individual. The case led to legislative changes as well. Arizona passed new regulations requiring greater transparency from HOAs and establishing an ombudsman office to handle disputes between homeowners and their associations. Several other states followed suit, using what became known as the Sycamore Ridge case as an example of why reform was needed. As for my vacant lot, I eventually completed my desert garden project. It became a gathering place for neighbors and a symbol of our community's resilience. Sometimes I sit there in the evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, reflecting on how a small patch of land became the catalyst for so much change. 2 years after Margaret's sentencing, I received a letter from the Arizona Department of Corrections. Margaret was requesting an early parole hearing, claiming she had been rehabilitated and posed no risk to the community. The letter asked if I would like to submit a statement to the parole board. I thought long and hard about my response. Part of me wanted to oppose her release, to ensure she served every day of her sentence. But another part recognized that vindictiveness wouldn't heal our community. After consulting with Deanna and some of the other victims, I wrote a carefully worded letter to the parole board. I didn't oppose Margaret's parole outright, but I detailed the extensive harm she had caused and requested that, if released, she be prohibited from serving on any HOA board or engaging in real estate transactions. The parole board denied her request, citing the calculated nature of her crimes and continued lack of remorse. She would serve at least 5 more years before becoming eligible again. Life in Sycamore Ridge gradually returned to normal, or rather, a new normal. The once fearful atmosphere had been replaced by genuine community engagement. Neighbors looked out for each other, attended meetings regularly, and participated in decision-making. The HOA still enforced standards, but with a focus on community welfare rather than punitive action. I became involved in advocacy work, speaking at conferences about HOA reform and helping homeowners in other communities who faced similar situations. Deanna and I collaborated on a guide for homeowners that outlined their rights and provided strategies for dealing with problematic associations. 3 years after the trial, I was approached by a journalist writing a book about HOA abuses across the country. She wanted to feature the Sycamore Ridge case as her central example. After some consideration, I agreed to share my story in detail, hoping it would help prevent similar situations elsewhere. The book, titled Power and Property: How Homeowners Associations Changed America, became a national bestseller and further amplified conversations about HOA reform. I received emails from homeowners across the country sharing their own experiences and thanking me for speaking out. One message stood out among the hundreds I received. It was from Brenda Taylor, Margaret's former assistant, who had moved to Colorado after the trial. "I still have nightmares about working for Margaret," she wrote. "For a long time, I felt guilty for not speaking up sooner, but seeing you stand your ground gave me the courage to finally tell the truth. Thank you for fighting back when so many others couldn't." Her words reminded me that the impact of standing up to injustice often extends far beyond what we can see. Sometimes, one person's refusal to be silenced creates space for others to find their voice. 5 years after Margaret's sentencing, I received notification of another parole hearing. This time, I decided to attend in person, wanting to see for myself whether she had changed. The hearing room was small and austere, with fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows. Margaret entered wearing a gray prison uniform, her once perfect blonde bob now showing gray roots and cut in a utilitarian style. She looked older, the sharp angles of her face more pronounced. When given the opportunity to speak, Margaret surprised me with what seemed like genuine contrition. "I've had 5 years to reflect on my actions," she said, her voice less commanding than I remembered. "I abused the trust of my community and hurt people who had done nothing wrong. There's no excuse for what I did, only an explanation. I became so focused on saving my husband's business that I lost sight of right and wrong." She went on to describe the counseling and education programs she'd completed in prison, including courses in ethics and community service. She expressed a desire to use her experience to help others avoid similar pitfalls. When it was my turn to speak, I found myself conflicted. The woman before me seemed genuinely changed, yet the harm she had caused was profound. I decided to speak from the heart. "Miss Wilson's actions didn't just affect property, they affected people's sense of safety and belonging in their own community," I told the board. "That said, I believe in the possibility of redemption. If Miss Wilson is truly committed to making amends, perhaps the best way to do that is through education and advocacy rather than returning to the real estate world." The parole board deliberated for 30 minutes before announcing their decision. Parole granted, with strict conditions. Margaret would be required to wear an ankle monitor for 1 year, could not engage in real estate transactions or serve on any community board, and had to complete 500 hours of community service related to consumer education. As she was led from the room, Margaret paused near where I was sitting. "Mr. Ortiz," she said quietly, "I know an apology isn't enough, but I am truly sorry for what I did to you and the others. Thank you for not opposing my parole." I nodded but didn't trust myself to speak. The moment was too complex for simple words. Outside the hearing room, Deanna was waiting for me. We had remained friends after the case, occasionally meeting for coffee or community events. "How do you feel?" she asked as we walked to the parking lot. "Conflicted," I admitted. "Part of me thinks she should serve the full 10 years. Another part hopes she's genuinely changed." "That's understandable," Deanna replied. "The justice system is supposed to be about rehabilitation as much as punishment. Maybe she'll actually do some good now." "Maybe," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. 6 months after Margaret's release, I spotted her at a state legislative hearing on proposed HOA reforms. She was sitting in the back row, taking notes and keeping to herself. When she noticed me watching her, she gave a small, awkward nod of acknowledgement before returning her attention to the speakers. Later, I learned that she had been working with a consumer rights organization, using her insider knowledge to help identify and prevent HOA abuses. According to a mutual acquaintance, she never mentioned her own case, presenting herself simply as someone with experience in property management. As for Larry Wilson, he remained in prison, having received fewer credits for good behavior than Margaret. His development company had been dissolved, its assets sold to pay restitution to the victims. 7 years after the bulldozer first appeared on my lot, I made a decision that surprised many of my neighbors. I decided to run for the Sycamore Ridge HOA board. Tom was stepping down as president after 4 successful years, and he encouraged me to consider taking his place. "We need someone who understands what can go wrong when power isn't checked," he told me. "Someone who'll stand up for the homeowners, not just the rules." The election was held at the annual community picnic, a tradition that had been revived after Margaret's departure. Standing under the shade of a ramada, surrounded by neighbors grilling hot dogs and children playing, I gave a short speech about my vision for our community. "Sycamore Ridge has been through a lot together," I said. "We've seen how an HOA can be weaponized against the very people it's meant to serve. but we've also seen how it can bring people together when governed with transparency and respect. I want to continue building on the foundation. Tom and the current board have established a community where rules exist to protect all of us, not control us. I was elected by a significant margin, along with 4 other board members who shared my philosophy of balanced governance. At our first meeting, the board unanimously elected me as president, a position I accepted with a deep sense of responsibility. One of my first acts as president was to establish a community mediation committee to resolve disputes before they escalated to formal violations. We also revised the architectural guidelines to be more flexible while still maintaining property values, and created a more transparent budget process that gave homeowners greater input on how their fees were spent. The vacant lot that had started it all remained a special place in our community. The desert garden had flourished, with native plants attracting butterflies and hummingbirds. Neighbors often gathered there for small events or quiet contemplation. Sometimes, new residents would ask about the plaque installed near the seating area, which read, "In honor of those who stand for justice and community. Sycamore Ridge, 2025. I would tell them the abbreviated version of our community's story, not to dwell on past wounds, but to ensure the lessons weren't forgotten. 8 years after Margaret's sentencing, I received an unexpected email. The subject line read, "Request for meeting Margaret Wilson." The message was brief and formal. She was writing a book about HOA reform and wanted to include my perspective. She proposed meeting at a public cafe to discuss whether I would be comfortable being interviewed. She emphasized that she would understand completely if I declined. After consulting with Deanna, who advised caution but acknowledged that the meeting might provide closure, I agreed to meet Margaret at a coffee shop in downtown Scottsdale. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a laptop and notebook. She looked different than she had at the parole hearing, healthier, more at peace, though the confident bearing that had once veered into arrogance was gone. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Ortiz," she said, standing briefly as I took the seat across from her. "You can call me Zach," I replied, surprising myself with the offer of familiarity. We spent 2 hours talking about what had happened and the changes that had come afterward. Margaret explained that her book wasn't a memoir but rather a guide to reforming problematic HOA structures, with case studies illustrating how things go wrong. "I'm not using Sycamore Ridge as an example without permission," she assured me. "That's why I wanted to meet. If you and the other homeowners prefer I not include it, I'll respect that." "Why are you doing this?" I asked, genuinely curious about her motivations. She considered the question carefully before answering. "Partly atonement, I suppose. I can't undo what I did, but I can try to prevent others from making similar mistakes, both HOA leaders who might abuse their power and homeowners who might fall victim to that abuse." By the end of our conversation, I had decided to allow her to include our case, provided she shared drafts of those sections with me and the other affected homeowners for approval. It was a strange form of collaboration with someone who had once been my adversary, but it felt like the right decision. Margaret's book was published the following year, receiving significant attention in real estate and community governance circles. The chapter on Sycamore Ridge was unflinching in its account of her crimes and their impact. She donated all proceeds to organizations supporting HOA reform and helping victims of real estate fraud. 10 years after Margaret first attempted to steal my land, Sycamore Ridge had transformed. We were now held up as an example of effective community governance, with other HOAs sending representatives to learn from our practices. The desert garden on my once vacant lot had become a symbol of that transformation from barren ground to flourishing community space. On the anniversary of the sentencing, I held a small gathering in the garden for those who had been part of the journey. Deanna was there, as were Tom and several other neighbors who had stood by me during the investigation and trial. We shared stories, not just about the fraud case, but about how our community had grown in its aftermath. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the garden, I realized that what had begun as a nightmare had ultimately strengthened both me and our community. The vacant lot that Margaret coveted had become something more valuable than any real estate development. It had become the heart of a neighborhood that had learned the true meaning of community. That evening, as my guests departed and I remained alone in the garden, I thought about how easily things could have gone differently. If I hadn't fought back, if Deanna hadn't believed in my case, if Detective Rodriguez hadn't been thorough in his investigation, Margaret might have succeeded, not just with my property, but with countless others. It reminded me that justice doesn't happen automatically. It requires vigilance and courage from ordinary people willing to stand up when something isn't right. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change a community or even to change the law. As I walked back to my house under a sky full of stars, I felt a sense of peace that had been long in coming. The HOA president who sold my vacant lot without permission had served her time, both literally and figuratively. The judge who gave her 10 years for real estate fraud had ensured justice was served. And I had found my place in a community that now stood for something worth protecting. The land remained mine, but in a deeper sense, it belonged to all of us, a testament to what happens when people come together to right a wrong and build something better in its place.